Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 7 of Series 6. The question this evening is, can a value theory ethics supersede all others, as well as be a primary expression of value? The reading that's related to this topic can be taken from my work, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 8. So in these 3 workshops, we have been discussing how values are expressed in the world in 3 ways. That is, in the 3 activities of meaning or purpose, religion, and today ethics. This is even though values are found to some extent in every human activity, and even though I have advocated a principle of life in terms of value. Yet I have argued that the concept and the phenomenon of value, like consciousness, has paradoxically been neglected, and this neglect increases the suspicion that something important may have been overlooked, namely not only the above principle of life, but also a theory of ethics based on value. This is despite my doubts about the adequacy of ethics as a category of human understanding. So today I want to present an alternative theory of ethics that is also compatible with wider issues of life. I call this a value theory of ethics based on the principle of an affirmation of value or the value of value. Robert Nozick and others have spoken about the value of values. I'm talking about the value of value. Values are, of course, particular values, and value describes all values in general as an objective. And value in general can be posed as an objective like other collectives such as consciousness or even happiness. Yet before presenting an alternative value theory ethics, I need to offer a critique of the standard theories. These are taken to be the 3 theories of Kantian, utilitarian, and Aristotle's virtue theory ethics. There are, of course, many other theories, but are relegated as subsidiaries for good reason. These include existentialist ethics, ethical egoism, divine command theory, and others. To criticize the essentials of Kant's ethics, we should first leave aside many common peripheral criticisms, such as his injunction that we must never lie, his neglect of consequences, and conflicts of moral rights. We should also ignore his sexism, homophobia, and his other cultural prejudices. In my view, the major failure of Kant's ethics derives from its reliance on cognition and reason as universalization. This is opposed by Hume's law that a prescriptive moral ought can't be derived from a factual is. More recently, Philippa Foot has doubted that Kant's categorical imperative is indeed categorical. That is, Kant's moral imperative is only an imperative on some prior premise like a feeling. And Elizabeth Anscombe also argued that Kant's reliance on duty, obligation and law had weakened or disappeared. And similarly, in my view, Kant's ungraduated outlook results in an antiquated, one-dimensional perspective. Utilitarianism, though, sweeps aside problems of metaphysics with the idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number. the greatest happiness for the greatest number, is also difficult to dispute as practical social policy. But utilitarianism is woefully inadequate as an ethics because it omits so much. It omits intention, character, and the wide range of experiences that ethics should encompass. So for these and other reasons, I can't regard utilitarianism as a credible theory. Aristotle's virtue theory ethics prizes excellence and character and disposition, and these expressed in the virtues. The virtues are dispositions or states like courage, loyalty, honesty, generosity, and magnanimity. Virtue theory is favoured in modern thought because of this emphasis on character and its aversion to rules. The objective of virtue theory also isn't just ethical conduct, but a flourishing good life. But as a theory, virtue theory problematically justifies the virtues by cultural conventions and by nature. For these and other reasons, virtue theory can't provide clear principles of action an ethical theory needs. Yet I can draw a parallel between virtue theory and the value theory of ethics that I want to consider. This is because the virtues are typically value states, enabling virtue theory to be reinterpreted as value theory. But we have other considerations to make before getting to that point, such as the consideration, given the above failures of ethics, we must ask, what then is ethics or morals? This question can't now be answered ostensively by the examples of Kantian, utilitarian and virtue ethics. And ethics is also sometimes inadequately defined as having to have relations with other people. But both of these methods can now, on reflection, seem to be inadequate. In our inquiries, we have previously defined ethical principles as values that guide moral action. More specifically, morality involves judgments about matters that are deemed to be moral. This is deliberately unspecific because what is deemed to be moral isn't fixed or definitive. Yet more specifically, morality can be defined as the process of those valuations being reflected back onto the agent. Actions considered moral reflect positive judgments and values back onto the agent. Conversely, actions considered immoral reflect negative judgments. Yet reflective value can also be part of an authentic expression of value of an agent who values himself. But at worst, a moralistic judgment is made to establish that, for example, you are bad and I am good. Another question is, how can we explain the experience of moral obligation that we feel compelled to act? This isn't the same issue as explaining why we are motivated to act in particular theories of ethics. I'm talking about the feeling that morally we must act, whatever theory we believe in. One explanation can also be applied to the experience of free will. That is, our limited imagination in perceiving alternative courses of action compel one's course of action. And an identification with our own thoughts can amplify this feeling as having only one course of action. Yet there is a more powerful motivational force at work here. it is the above idea that moral action enhances our self-value that is arguably a primary driving force. Yet this is an argument for subjective motivation rather than from a particular conception of things. It is also an argument for the significance of value that is a concern in this and other workshops. This brings us to my point that, like consciousness, value as an aspect of consciousness has been neglected and overlooked. I have advanced elsewhere an error theory of the neglect of consciousness that I won't repeat here. Yet I can note that it follows from three features of consciousness, which are immersion, regression, and non-referentiality. Out of the many arguments and indications of the neglect of value, I will only mention three. In Greek thought, the moral ought, intrinsic value of persons, and the concept of value are barely visible. And then Hume's discovery of distinguishing ought from a factual is was initially overlooked and often still is today. And in the 19th century, science was regarded as objective and value-free. Now it's seen as value-laden. Yet the significance of value can be seen in the fundamental and indeed all activities of life. In religion, for example, God is the believer's highest value, and various dogmas express particular values. A meaningful life is worthwhile, lit up is valuable and lit up by value. And ethical principles are values that guide our actions. So it's even a more remarkable fact that we have no theory of value as a principle of ethics or meaning. Happiness has been formulated as a principle of ethics in utilitarianism. Reason and duty have been formulated as principles in Kantian ethics. Character has been formulated as a principle of ethics in Aristotle's virtue theory ethics. Value itself, though, as a guiding principle of ethics, is missing from moral philosophy. This view is echoed in the early 19th century by Charles Grey Shaw. He states that value as a principle of ethics has been overlooked by both ancient and moral philosophy. Barry Maguire endorses this neglect of value in writing about, I quote, the promising but surprisingly overlooked value-based theory of reasons. It's essential to state that we aren't just talking about the application of value in which ethical principles are values. Again, all ethical principles are values that guide moral actions, values like utility, duty, and character. But value as a principle of ethics, or a value theory ethics, employs value itself as an objective. For example, we can compare and contrast another theory of ethics, say utilitarianism, with a value theory ethics. The guiding principle of utilitarianism is utility, or the maximization of happiness. The principle of utility is thereby a guiding value, and happiness is valued as an objective. The objectives and outcomes of utilitarianism are affect states like happiness and pleasure. But Kantian ethics is based on cognition and volition, and these are parts of its system of value. It values cognition and reason as universalization and a certain conception of things. And it values volition in the form of good intention as the goodwill and duty. Yet Kant argues that even goodwill and duty must be justified by reason. Kant's ethics employs a categorical imperative that calls for necessary relations between thought and action. But value theory ethics calls for our best judgments based on fact and reason, not necessary relations. And our best judgments will eventually be directed towards value as the preferred principle. This is because of the satisfactoriness of both the theory and the experience of value. For example, on value theory ethics, the difficult problem of justification is resolved as a process of value. Its objectives are value states, and its guiding principle is value itself. And the guiding principle of value theory ethics is the affirmation of value, the value of value, or the will to value. Yet before explaining this view, we need to clarify this key term of value states. The notion of value states is my own term for mental states that necessarily contain values. For example, love, hate, dignity, self-esteem, honour, duty, and others. That is, unlike belief or perception, these states cannot exist without a value component. But value states are both positive and negative. Yet only positive value states are viable ethical objectives. Yet the principle of the will to value, the value, can also be used to distinguish positive values. That is, states like hate, resentment and jealousy can be said to negate rather than affirm value. Yet this distinction can also be made intuitively as a common sense means of checking. We can also define value states by contrasting them to cognitive states and affect states. Examples of cognitive states are thought, perception, reason, knowledge, belief, and doubt. Examples of affect states are pain, pleasure, happiness, affection, despair, anger, and others. Value ethics can now be introduced by comparison with virtue theory because the virtues are already value states. Value states are virtues like courage, loyalty, honesty, generosity, and magnanimity. Virtue theory can thereby be reinterpreted or reconceived as a value theory of ethics. This strategy retained the advantages of both virtue theory while resolving its problems with the concept of value. Two main problems of virtue theory are defining a principle of action and its cultural relativity. Value theory offers the will to value as a principle of action, and ethical normativity can be derived from the character and constraints of value. But any theory of ethics is required to demonstrate at least three things. 1. A foundation or basis. 2. A formal principle. And 3. Material outcomes of action in practice. The basis of value theory ethics are the structures and dynamics of consciousness and value, outlined here and elsewhere. Secondly, the formal principle of value theory ethics is the will to value, and the material content or outcome is provided by the judgment of actions as good or bad. Given for the moment the principle of the will to value, argued shortly, a value theory ethics can then be constructed. That is, as an acting agent, I value myself and seek to maintain and further my value. Therefore, I must ask, What must I do to maintain and further my value? Actions judged as virtuous will accrue value. Actions judged as bad will negate value. For example, taking things that don't belong to you and that you don't need is greed, which reflects negative value. And harming others without cause is pathological, which also reflects negative value on yourself. Moreover, other people are instances of intrinsic value who require due consideration. But this account of value raises three problems that we must deal with. The above is a rationalist ends-means account that will have to be broadened. The question of other people also needs further attention, and relying on the agent's best judgment incurs the problem of fallibilism. Of course, such judgments will be contingent and fallible because they depend upon the agent's limited knowledge. Yet this compares favourably to Popper's fallibilist view of true science, that it can be mistaken. On a value theory ethics, we must also work out what is the best thing to do in a pragmatic way. And fallibilism in science or ethics isn't a weakness but a strength. For example, traditional and Kantian moral values have been thought to be justified by objectivity and reason. But there are at least three problems with this approach. 1. There are no objective values argued by Mackey, others and myself. 2. Hume's problem of mandating the acceptance of objective values through reason. 3. There is a misplaced wish to universalise right or wrong moral action, for example, in Kant's extreme position that we must never lie under any circumstances. Moreover, the primacy of value traditionally given to objectivity is in fact a contingent choice. We can similarly attribute primacy of value to pragmatic reasons for making a choice. Yet on a value theory ethics, the material content of action is fallibilist, but inescapable for two reasons. 1. The material content of action is directed by our best assessments of reason, fact and value. 2. The principle that the satisfaction of human motivation will inevitably be directed toward value. This approach replaces untenable ethical necessity with a more arguable inescapability. Yet there are no definitive criteria for determining the material content of right action, as indeed must be the case. Actions will differ under different circumstances by different people as expressions of the will to value. Yet there are other problems of the strategy of seeking to maintain and further my value as a rational agent. One problem is that maximising my own value doesn't seem to be an adequately moral motivation. Underlining the point, virtue theorists criticise Kantians as just attempting to do good, like a do-gooder. This is because virtue theorists regard real moral good as internalisation into character and disposition. And with respect to the question of enlightened self-interest as a moral motivation for valuing other people, Bernard Williams presents the possibility of self-indulgence for such theories of ethics. He writes, "What the agent cares about is not so much other people as himself caring about other people. I want to respond to this issue by distinguishing reflexive from non-reflexive forms of value theory ethics. Value theory ethics is presented above as a rational and reflexive process of choosing value. Yet non-reflexive forms of value theory ethics are also available. Virtue and existentialist ethics are typically non-reflexive, that is, they express dispositions or authenticity. Yet virtue and existentialist ethics can also accommodate a determination of right action through reason. That is, value ethics can similarly produce action simply as a rational expression of the agent's values. For example, the agent can act on reflection according to how his actions reflect well or badly on himself. But on value ethics, an agent can legitimately hold internalized values that he seeks to express. On this view, he doesn't ask, how can I maximize my value, but how can I best express my values? These values can be better or worse, and are expressed in action and in relation to other people. Yet, these values can be informed for the better by the principles of value as suggested. Moreover, the agent's values can be internalized as aspects of his character and dispositions, as in virtue theory. The agent can thereby act pre-reflectively, as in virtue theory, avoiding recriminations of self-interest. Value theory ethics can thereby express its values in three ways. One, as a rational choice to maximize or develop one's own value, which may entail respect for others. Two, as an expression of the values I hold without an overt pursuit of self-interest or self-value. Three, as a pre-reflective expression of internalized values from within my character and dispositions. In this case, the good person doesn't will good or try to be good, he is good, as in virtue theory, or as Yoda of Star Wars says, do not try, do. I want to say something more in support of these expressions of value and the principle of the will to value. The question is often posed of, what does the will to value lead to? Firstly, it need not lead to anything. It could be its own reward as a value or a tenable theory. But I hold that the will to value, or the value of value, results in a certain sufficiency of value. Sufficiencies of value are value states like self-esteem, dignity, courage, patience, and magnanimity. Yet, of course, human finitude means that sufficiencies are always insufficient and are works in progress. And this insufficiency, as well as sufficiency, that is, also drive value towards a further will to value. I've explained this sufficiency of value in detail elsewhere, but I can make a couple of comparisons here. Firstly, value sufficiency has a certain independence of experience comparable to happiness and pleasure. Yet more enlightening, we can recall the idea that God is the believer's highest value, characterized by sufficiency. And Aristotle's eudaimonia is the supreme good, which he qualifies as self-sufficient. As the supreme good is a moral concept, it can be inferred to be a sufficiency of value. I am making 2 points here. One is that value sufficiency is both an actual and hypothetically ideal objective in a theory of value. Another is about the internal sufficiency of value that can be expressed as a disposition to act. Yet all theories of ethics must also deal with the noted problem of value formulated by Hume and More. Hume's law, or principle, is that a prescriptive moral ought can't be derived from a factual is. This is thought proven by More's naturalistic fallacy of identifying moral good with natural properties. This is the problem of justification that all theories of ethics must overcome. Aristotle seemed to ignore the problem with an acceptance of virtue as excellence of character. Kant takes it that we are obliged to act on the dictates of reason that reveals our duty and the moral law. Mill holds it that psychologically and metaphysically impossible not to desire the pleasant. But as I have argued elsewhere, we can choose otherwise and walk away from these injunctions. In analytic philosophy, the problem of justification is set within the distinction between cognitive and non-cognitive states. But this classification is biased towards cognitivism and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So I supplement this classification using the four states of cognition, affect, will and value. This classification also brings attention to value as a category in its own right. Yet the question still is how to justify or explain activities like morals, meaning and motivation with these states. Cognitive theories are said to be impotent and unable to motivate action or morals. Non-cognitive theories are said to be blind and unable to guide action. As already implied, it's my view that a value theory ethics can resolve the problem of justification in two ways. One, by taking value as a precondition of an ethical process rather than having to infer value. Two, by being able to produce a self-validating principle of value. These are in themselves arguments for adopting value as the kind of state which can provide a solution. Yet we can offer more extensive arguments involving self-validation and structures of value and consciousness. We must assume that the long-standing cognitive-non-cognitive debate has already been noted. We must also reiterate the idea of the will to value as a self-validating principle given in the introduction to this series. Self-validating principles are found in logic and mathematics, but not thought possible in physics or ethics. Self-validation can be established in logic and mathematics by non-contradiction. For example, logic is determined by the self-evident and self-validating truths of Aristotle's four basic principles of logic. David Hilbert described mathematics as avoidance of contradiction and is therefore a self-validating a priori. And a self-validating system within the human sphere is Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Physics isn't self-validating because it's an a posteriori system of contingent observations. Importantly, mathematics and logic are self-validating but can't establish principles for systems of physics or ethics. But I propose that the will to value is self-validating because the alternative is contradictory and self-negating. the will to value can also be described as the value of value, the affirmation of value, or the pursuit of value. Firstly, the will to value as the value of value isn't a tautology. It isn't a tautology because value can affirm value, or not, as the system of value of which it is a part. But it must affirm or value the system of value of which it is a part in order to value anything. And in this way, comparable to I think therefore I am, value itself presupposes the will to value, and therefore not to value value is contradictory and self-negating. Yet not valuing value can be self-contradictory in different ways. As above, not valuing value is a denial of the principle by which you are denying value. Not valuing value can also be a denial of an aspect of consciousness which we can't escape. And not valuing value can be a denial of a positive principle which is regressive. We are unexpectedly talking about constraints on choice derived from subjectivity. Hegel also paradoxically finds constraints arising from the exercise of freedom in his philosophy of right. Sartre follows Hegel, but because consciousness, choice, value and freedom are mutually implicative. Sartre is then able to go on to insist that we are condemned to choose and we are condemned to be free. The point for us is that denial of choice can thereby be interpreted as a negation of value, and the avoidance of choice and freedom as bad faith can be viewed as regressive or contradictory. Sartre's notion of the spirit of seriousness illustrates the contradiction of not valuing the subjectivity of value. The spirit of seriousness is to take subjective values as objective to avoid freedom and responsibility. Either principles or objects can be thought to have objective value rather than subjective value. The seriousness is to say that certain values are objective and therefore I have no choice. But if those values are subjective, that would be a contradictory position. So there are at least three arguments here in favour of the will to value as a principle of ethics and of life. 1. Justification, self-validation and internal coherence of value as a system of value calls for a will to value. 2. To avoid physical or cognitive to value physical or cognitive objects instead of value itself is ultimately regressive. 3. Not to value or affirm value itself is contradictory, self-negating and self-defeating. Therefore, the will to value, the value to value, is both valid and a self-validating principle. My position is that not valuing value as the will to value is contradictory, self-negating and self-defeating. Therefore, the will to value, the value, is a self-validating system. But that does not make it an adequate principle of ethics, which has to fulfill many other functions. These are functions like truth, human practicality, and providing material content of action. One of these requirements is a resolution of the noted problems of value posed by Hume, More and others. To reiterate, Hume explained that a prescriptive moral ought can't be derived from a factual is. Value theory ethics mitigates this problem by starting with the presence of value, not with facts or reason. This can be achieved with a structural or a phenomenological account of the origins of value. Yet such an account of the origins of value provides at least two requirements of value theory ethics. One, it explains the basis on which the will to value can be established. Two, it makes the immediate point of establishing a foundation for a value theory of ethics. And three, such an account explains the significance of value as an aspect of consciousness and human life. In my view, a credible analysis and explanation of value is found in the phenomenology of consciousness. This is because phenomenology generally makes a close identification between consciousness and value. For example, Heidegger cites care as the being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value. And he continues that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. So what we are saying here is that value and consciousness are coexistent. This is explained with Sartre's close identification between consciousness, value, and choice as selection. He writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. And Sartre writes that choice isn't just preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. But Sartre doesn't actually provide an analysis tracing choice back to its ontological foundation. But we can fill in by saying that contrast is a form of selection essential to cognition and thereby to consciousness. And we can continue that contrast and selection are expressions of choice that produce value. For example, when I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. These are the kind of selections that are essential to epistemic contrast and perceptions. For example, a white spot on a white board can't be seen. It needs contrast. But at least two objections can be made to this kind of explanation of incipient values. One, values also emerge from social and biological sources without selection or choice. And two, these incipient values are not the values we need for motivation, morals, meaning or purpose. In response to social or biological values, such must be experienced in consciousness in order to be values. That is, an automatic propensity to action is not a value. Such are only latent or potential values. They only become values as mental states and moral values on selection as preferences. Yet animals are conscious creatures who could have values but not moral values. Also, incipient values inherent to consciousness do not provide us with prescriptive moral values. But unlike social or naturalistic accounts, the above account is able to develop one with the faculty of choice. Also, in response to the criticism of explaining only trivial values, we can take the phenomenological analysis further. Martin Heidegger emphasizes temporality and time as the horizon of being. Edmund Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. That is, we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as through the diversity in space. Judgments and values must be continually produced to cope with the flow of experience. Again, I look to my left and see a window, I look to my right and see a door, and I choose to walk through that door. Outside I find someone lying on the floor. What do? Do I help? Do I walk past? Or do I ignore the person? Now we need recourse to the value theory of ethics that I have outlined above. In conclusion, I will sum up my arguments about value theory ethics. Firstly, that ethics, yet particularly value theory ethics, show how value is expressed in the world. Secondly, that value theory ethics is a viable account that supplants traditional theories. And my arguments for value theory ethics take both positive and negative forms. Negative arguments include the failure of standard ethical theories calling for an alternative value theory. And the failure of standard ethical theories is also due to arguments that I have made elsewhere. These are that inadequacies of cognitive, affective and volitional states direct us towards values and value states. That is, a value theory ethics is constructed on the will to value, value, and the pursuit of value. And the will to value produces a certain sufficiency of value in value states like self-esteem and magnanimity. Yet this will to value isn't simply self-value or maximization of value, but a quality of value. And that sufficiency and quality of value provide an ethic in the form of a value theory ethics. Such a historical development of morality and ethical theory is entirely expected, yet has always been resisted. Development is evident from Judaic ethics of law to Christian and Kantian ethics of intention. Development continues to modern and postmodern views of circumstances and individuality. And I see value theory ethics as part of this development. But I have grave doubts about whether ethics and morals is an adequate means of describing human experience. That is, not just as the limitation of not being able to describe the whole of human experience, but not being able to properly describe that area of value experience usually assigned to ethics. So I have discussed this issue elsewhere, but don't have time to discuss it in this series. In this respect, I submit the will to value and sufficiency of value not as principles for an alternative ethics, but as points of departure for another way of understanding human existence as consciousness. Next week we'll be taking a deeper look at the question, what is value? So let me have your comments and criticisms on websites like meetup.com Philosophy of Value workshops.